From MNTech, the Micro Nanotechnology Education Center, and JATE, the Journal of Advanced Technological Education. This is the JATE Writer Studio. In each session, we'll have a guided conversation with a publisher and published author. We highlight authors who publish articles in peer-reviewed journals like the JATE so that they can share their story and writing process with you. We want to give authors a voice to share their tips and tricks about how to write peer-reviewed journal articles. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Jillian Blatti. Jillian is an associate professor of chemistry at Pasadena City College. Jillian, welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Appreciate the invitation.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So today we'll discuss Jillian's article, Investigating Substrates Amphifu-Red and ABTS in the colorimetric detection of DNA enzyme activity and localized DNA condensates. Jillian, before we talk about writing and your JAT articles, I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Describe where you live and work, and talk a little bit about your background.
I would love to. So I am an associate professor of chemistry at PCC, Pasadena City College. I've been here for 12 years. I run a research group here through the NSF Future Manufacturing Program, and we focus on DNA nanotechnology. I did my PhD and master's in chemistry at UC San Diego, where I was part of the algae biotechnology community. We were looking at engineering sustainable biofuels. And it's been an honor to lead the students here at PCC in research. Recently, we've been presenting. We presented at American Chemical Society last week in San Diego. We're in the process of drafting a few more manuscripts, and I've recruited a new cohort of students to come work with me this summer at both UCLA and PCC. So thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself.
Not a problem, not a problem. And if you have more manuscripts, please feel free to submit that to the JATE, and we'll see about getting them published.
Would love to.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, so very briefly, describe the article that we're discussing in just a couple of sentences. We'll talk more in just a couple of sentences, please. We'll talk more in detail about the article in a little bit.
Okay, sure. So this is the first paper actually that came out of my newest iteration of my research on DNA nanotechnology. And in this paper, we talk about essentially localizing biochemical reactions to compartments made out of DNA. And the interesting thing is the biochemical reactions themselves are also catalyzed by DNA-based enzymes. My collaborators and I, so my collaborators are from Caltech, UCLA, and UCSB, and we design these open-ended explorations for the students. And so part of what we wanted the students to explore was the substrates involved in this colorimetric, so color changing reaction, and develop ways of analyzing this and understanding whether we had actually achieved our objective of localizing those reactions within the DNA liquids. Just a quick thing at the end of the paper, we go into our outreach efforts because what we like to do is translate the research that we do in the lab into educational activities, and I actually do them in my classes with the research students as my learning assistants.
Okay, okay. Awesome, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so about your writing techniques, what is your writing background, and where did you learn to write peer-reviewed journal articles?
That's a wonderful question. So I consider myself a writer. Writing is something that is dear to my heart, and I write every day. And so in graduate school, I really worked extremely hard on my writing. And this comes in different forms in the scientific world, right? We write grants to get funding in order to do our science. We write publications, right? Once we've achieved a particular amount of scientific work, we disseminate it and we put it out there for the world to see and to build upon. This is something that, I worked on very hard. So my boss in graduate school was also a very good writer, and he mentored me in this process. And so when I was a second-year graduate student, I wrote a full grant by myself in order to fund future research for the lab. And that process was an unbelievable experience for me. It took me a long time, to figure out the best way to write this grant, but it was an unbelievable experience in terms of being able to write a narrative in a persuasive type way.
Mhm.
Now, my first graduate school paper was actually an education paper. I always knew I wanted to be a teacher as well as a researcher. And so I wrote a paper about an activity where students can make algae biofuels in the classroom. And then a couple years later came my research paper, which discussed engineering algae for biodiesel. So one of the things that I would like to say that would helped me quite a bit was I had scientists around me that I respected their writing. And so it's hard at first as a new writer to kind of give up your writing and ask for feedback and critique, but it's absolutely essential. And so I went to trusted writers and I said, can you read this? Can you give me some feedback? Let me know what you think. And of course, they send it back to me, and there was many red marks and edits and that kind of thing. And once I kind of got over it, because that was the first time I had done something like that, I realized that it improved the paper. And when you go
Right.
through this process, this iterative process over and over again, the paper starts to evolve and grow into something much better than the initial draft, right? So it's
Right.
a beautiful thing. And this is something that I've continued to do. And now I mentor my research students in the same process. We're writing 2 more papers right now.
Okay. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was writing one of my papers, we had the same thing. Me and my partner, we came up with an idea. We wrote the paper, and
Mhm.
the first person that, no, the second person that saw it, we pretty much had to we had to rewrite it from scratch. That was alarming, but it was okay because again, this is the first time we had ever done it. So it felt good to see the final draft based on what we had first started with. So that was very, very helpful. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And then you mentioned a good point too, right? So the brainstorming process, like how you're going to tell the story, right? So it
Mhm.
starts off, I think, just by writing out a few ideas, sketching out some figures, and the figures themselves evolve, right? Like you have to be able to pictorially tell the story and organize
Mhm.
the data as well as with the written words. So that's an awesome point that you brought up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, so how did you find the co-authors for this article? And when you can't find co-authors, if you've written articles before by yourself, can you go at it all by yourself? Also, how did your co-authors contribute to you writing this paper?
That's a great question. So the co-authors on this paper are my collaborator at UCLA.
Mhm.
And, she was involved in developing the ideas with us. And then the students that worked with me in the lab, right? So the ones who actually were in the lab doing the experiments and working through it. And so
Mhm.
we all decided we're going to be on this paper together. And then we started drafting it. And initially, I will tell you, it was a different paper when we first submitted it than it turned out to be published. We initially were only going to focus on the DNA enzyme reaction by itself using one of the substrates, Amplifu, not
Mhm.
ABTS. But then some of the points that came back from the reviewers during the revision process, pointed to the fact that we needed a more complete picture of the research. And so they had suggested going through this kind of optimization assay for the enzymes that we were using. But we argued against that because what was missing was the overall picture of the research, right? The localization of the DNA enzyme catalyzed reaction within the liquids, the DNA liquids. And so once we pulled back and we actually described the entire process, it was much less niche and a little bit more complete. So
Okay.
yes, that's kind of what happened there.
Awesome, awesome. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. So, with most of our writers, sometimes you feel like you don't have enough. Either you don't have enough data, you don't have enough participants, you don't have enough experience, or the biggest factor in being a teacher and trying to be a writer, you don't have enough time. How did you know you had enough to start writing this article?
Great question, right? There's always so many decisions that you have to make in this process. But so at the beginning of science, right, that also starts with an idea and you draw out, possible results on paper, right? So I'll never forget my collaborators and I drawing out the potential results of this paper. And then last summer, it was achieved. So it was very nice to see something that we had hypothesized, something that we had predicted actually come to fruition in the lab. And so it was in that moment that I knew that we could publish what we had done. And so again, we just started with the brainstorming process, how we're going to tell the story, drafting the figures. So figures, I would say, is something that you really want to start with early on. And, they go through their own iteration. We use a program, I'll mention this as well. There's a new program called BioRender, and there's a for students, and it's, they're getting more and more templates in this program, but it's a nice way of making figures in a collaborative way. So we were working with BioRender quite a bit to make our figures.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Pretty good. All right. So, um, when you're writing a peer review journal, how
Mhm.
do you write yours? Do you write it from top to bottom? Do you work on one section and then move to the next? Um, and then build on another section? Do you do it in order? Do you do it out of order? Do you do maybe the summary first and introduction and methods, research? Exactly how do you write the sections in your paper? What order do you write this paper in?
That's a really, really good question. So it does not have to be in order, but it's nice to start with an outline, right, of the general sections. And then honestly, like just starting to get some words down on paper, some ideas down on paper. For me, like starting the thing is half the battle. Like once the stuff gets on the page, that's when the magic of editing can sort of start to happen. So yeah, I just kind of start writing the ideas and piecing them together. One thing that I really wanted to do was focus on the method section first, because that's very concrete, right? We know exactly the methods that we used, and so it's just a very focused, concise way of writing the experimental details. And then while that was happening, another student and I were drafting the figures. And that started just by hand. Okay, so I think it should look like this. This is a nice pictorial representation. Now let's go into some software. We use Illustrator and BioRender, as I mentioned, combination of the two to kind of start getting those figures in order, right? And both of these things are evolving at the same time, right? You're adding this. And then we also use Google Docs. That's a good suggestion when you're doing it in a collaborative way, because
Right.
you can make little comments, you can assign tasks to different people. I
Mhm.
picked that up from my collaborator at UCLA because that's how we write papers together. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That sounds good. Sounds good. All right. How long did it take you to write this particular paper?
This one took me a long time. And the reason is, again, because of that second round of revisions where they had suggested these experiments that I felt didn't fit into the big picture. They kind of veered off to the left. And so what I had to do was pull back and redesign the paper in context of what the overall research goals were. So this entailed making new figures, redesigning, right? If I showed you the first draft of the paper and then what was actually published, it's almost like two completely different papers. Like the first version was just a small portion of what the overall paper ended up becoming. So
Mhm.
there's definitely remnants in there. So it took me many weeks, I would say, like, I don't know how many hours, but um, in the hundreds for sure.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of my time writing, so it was a lot. But it was
I hear
wonderful
you.
because now it's out there and it looks really good, and other people
Mhm.
can learn from it, right?
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. When we did ours, we would write a little bit every Friday, and I'd say it took probably about between 4 to 6 months to get it all written, because there
Yeah,
were some days that we just couldn't do it. So, and then we double up like the next week. And again, once we got the first draft done, it looked one way. Got the revisions, made a totally different second draft, and that is the one that stuck. So I 100% understand.
100%
Yep,
understand.
yep,
Yeah,
yep.
and that's a good point too, like doing it in little chunks because you have other
Mhm.
things in your life to do, right? You have to
Yes.
teach your classes, you have to do your research. So
Yep.
finding that time, I think, is important.
Right, right, right. All right. So how did you find the references to include into your paper?
That's a good question. So we have a Dropbox with all the papers that are relevant to the research, right? Because we draw upon those papers as we're actually doing the experiments and designing them. So
Hmm.
there's a certain suite of papers that are just, part of this condensate nanostar DNA and started when we wrote the grant to fund the research. So we had it all organized already. And this, I have to give a lot of credit to my collaborators because they're very organized with these papers, and some of them are their papers. Like my collaborator, Paul Rodemund, he, invented some of these techniques that we used. So that was pretty straightforward because we had already been also engaging in literature meetings where each week we would present a paper that was relevant to, our research. So that
Okay.
kind of came naturally. It's an important part of the process, right? Because you're linking what you did to what other people did.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. All right. So after you've written a paper, after everything's been approved, what was the manuscript submission process like? What documents did you need to upload?
Okay, that's a good question. So there's always going to be the manuscript file in Word format and in PDF format. And that has the figures integrated into it, but you also have to submit high resolution figures, right? Images of the figures.
Mhm.
And then of course there's a cover letter where you, talk to the editors and you, of the work and its importance and significance. And then
Right.
there's the supporting information, right? So anything that supports the paper, but isn't really part of the main story, you put in the supporting information. And so we have a lot of stuff in there that's very helpful. If somebody wanted to reproduce these experiments, if somebody had further questions on some of the ideas that we have in there. So those are all the files that we submitted. The supporting, sorry, the lights just went off in the room.
That's fine.
Okay, there we go. It's like
I was making sure that wasn't my computer. I'm like, what's going on my
like
screen?
if you don't move, like the lights will just go off. So it's an energy efficiency thing.
That's fine.
But yeah, that's a thing to know too, right? Because you want the most high resolution images that you can. So typically it's a TIFF image, and we use Adobe Illustrator, and so you can export those high resolution images, and that's really important for the quality of the paper.
Okay. All right. For the JAT article that you wrote, did you use the JATE template that was online provided for you to write your submission?
Yes, I would highly recommend using the template because
Okay.
it's much better to write it directly in the template than try to translate it over.
Right.
Um,
Right.
it looks much nicer, and that you
Mhm.
have everything, ready to go.
Okay. All right. Now, for other publications, did they give you a template, or did you have to figure it out on your own?
A lot of times when I'm writing a paper, I'll just write it in a Word document,
Mhm.
especially if the decision hasn't been made where we're submitting it to. And so that's also how we wrote the grant for this research. But if we're like, for example, sometimes I publish in Journal of Chemical Education. And
Mhm.
so when I publish in that one, I'm always writing in the template.
Okay.
Because it just makes it much easier. You could submit it through the ACS Paragon Plus system.
Yeah.
So it depends, but if you know where you're going, I would suggest putting it in the template from the onset.
Okay. All right. No problem. No problem. So for JATE, we are now using Scholastica as our submission process. So we still
Yeah.
have to have the cover letter. You still have to write it in a JATE template, but we just submit ours through Scholastica now. Okay.
I
All right.
like the Scholastic. I like it a lot.
Yep. Yep. I'm actually a one of the editors, and it's very easy to find reviewers to review the submissions and us go in and make our own edits. Then we can send out emails, if you need to revise something, if you need to make changes, or if we approve it or deny it. It's like a click of a button and you change the name in a couple of different pieces and you're done. So it's much easier to do it that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. It's nice.
Yeah. All right. So what was the peer review process like? How did reading the reviews that you got from your article, how did that make you feel? And what did you do once you received these reviews?
Well, that's a good question about the feel, right? Because my students, this was their first paper ever. For me,
Hmm.
I've been through the process many times, so I've learned to not take right?
Right.
These are all suggestions, and it's for the cause of sound science, right? So really making sure that we're checked on certain things and making sure that things come across in the most the best way that they can. So I like suggestions. I like constructive criticism, and it's a nice back and forth. Like, for example, if they are suggesting, they had suggested a series of experiments that I thought were not relevant to the overall research goals. And so I pondered it for a while, like how to best address this, this suggestion on these experiments with this equipment that we didn't even have. And also, if in the context of what had been submitted, I definitely agreed with the reviewers. But then I pivoted and said, okay, well, if they can see the overall goal and the overall objectives, I don't think that they would be suggesting that particular set of experiments. So basically that one became a rebuttal. You say, okay, well, whereas this sounds like a very nice set of experiments and a very nice educational activity for the students to go through. One, we don't have the equipment, but two, it kind of veers left from the overall objective. So then I pulled back, we rewrote the paper, and we wrote it in the context of the localization to the condensates, the DNA liquids. And then it made much more sense, and the reviewers were very happy with what we did. So the students, I think, because they had me as a mentor and as a guide, they didn't take it as personally as maybe you might in your first time. I warned them that this was coming and that it they're good. So I think that we're okay with it. And we're going through our next couple ones with our new papers, and it's like they're seasoned professionals now already. So it's all good.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I've learned through writing articles and being an editor. If you're going to write a peer-reviewed article, you have to be able to take constructive criticism as a positive, and it's not a personal attack against you. We're all just looking for the best to be brought out from everybody. So this is the
Exactly.
best way to do it. Yep. Okay. All right. So we're coming close to our time of being done. So last question. What advice would you give to new writers who are starting their first peer-reviewed journal article?
That is such a good question. I would even take it back a step further before, like, as you're doing the science, I would have a vision of the paper in mind, right? Like, have an outline of, and even possible ideas for figures, like as you're going into the research, because that will focus you in the lab, that will focus you on the research. And my other piece of advice would be write as much as you possibly can. Like in your downtime in the lab, try to write up a summary of the experiments, right? Try to organize the figures, as you're doing the experiments, and then you'll know what you need to improve upon in the final product. So writing, revising, taking that feedback, right? Iterating and evolving really the manuscript. Going through that process as much as possible will make you a better writer. I tell my students the same thing. Write, get feedback from people who you respect and trust, and just keep improving upon it until it feels right, until it feels like the best possible version of what you can accomplish. So that's what I would say, and enjoy it. I would say enjoy it. I love the process. I love the brainstorming, the writing, but I also enjoy the editing and the evolution. It's really nice to see that final product, as we were discussing, when what those initial kind of, discussions and those initial drafts looked like. Like, it's almost like magic when you've evolved it and edited it to the best you possibly can. So keep at it, keep writing, and yeah, that's enjoying it is an important part as well.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Well, we appreciate it. On behalf of the JATE, I'd like to thank you again. Doctor, is it doctor?
It's Dr.
Yep,
Jillian
yep,
Blatti.
Doctor, yep, Dr. Jillian Blatti. I'd like to thank you for joining us for a little talk about your article. And I hope to see you soon. And for everybody out there in YouTube land, we will talk to you next time.
All right. Thank you so
Okay.
much, Thomas. Have a good
Okay.
one.
All right. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.